Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
I'm Christian, 32, and if you had asked me a few months ago what kind of person I was, I'd have said the quiet one. I'm not the type to start arguments or hold grudges. I was raised to be respectful, to help my family whenever they needed it, and to stay out of drama. But that kind of loyalty only works when it's mutual, when love and respect go both ways. Unfortunately, mine didn't. And last night, at a dinner that started off as another one of my mother's family traditions, I finally said something that shattered the illusion we'd all been living under. But to understand what happened last night, I need to start with what led to it, because this wasn't a single moment of anger. It was years of being treated like the lesser child, the one who should be grateful for scraps while my brother got the world handed to him. My parents had two kids, me and my younger brother, Nathan. Growing up, Nathan was the golden one, though my mom would never admit it outright. Everything about him was special in her eyes. When he got a B on a test, she'd say the teacher must have graded unfairly. When I got an A, she'd nod and say, "Good, that's what's expected." If I needed new shoes, I was told to wait until next month. When Nathan wanted a new pair because his old ones weren't trendy anymore, my mom would already be pulling out her wallet. It sounds petty, I know, but those small things build up when they happen for decades. Even when we became adults, the dynamic never changed. Nathan drifted from one job to another, never really sticking to anything. My parents always had an excuse for him. He just hasn't found his calling yet. Meanwhile, I worked my way through college, sometimes holding two part-time jobs just to afford rent. When I got my degree in engineering, I was proud, but my mom barely reacted. She said, "That's nice, honey," before asking if I could help Nathan with his resume. I guess that was the theme of my life. Me helping, them taking. I tried to overlook it because they were still my family. That's what you do, right? You forgive, you keep showing up, you pretend it doesn't sting as much as it does. Then I met Emily. She was everything I wasn't used to, warm, patient, and kind in a way that made me rethink what love actually feels like. My mom tolerated her at first, probably because Emily was quiet and polite. But as soon as we got engaged, the comments started. Subtle little digs disguised as jokes. "Don't let her wear white next to Nathan's fiancée. She might look too plain." Or, "Are you sure you can afford a decent ring on your salary?" Emily would just smile awkwardly, trying not to make it worse. I'd pull her aside later and apologize, but she'd always tell me not to worry about it. "They'll come around," she said. I wanted to believe her. Then came Nathan's wedding. I wish I could say I was surprised, but when my parents announced that they were paying for it, every last thing, from the venue to the honeymoon, I just stayed quiet. They booked a luxury resort, hired a live band, and sent out invitations printed on thick ivory paper. My mom bragged to anyone who'd listen about how her baby boy deserves the best. When I mentioned that Emily and I were still saving for our wedding, Mom's response was a shrug and a dismissive, "Well, we can't do this twice." So, we didn't have a big wedding. We married quietly at the courthouse with just a few close friends. My parents didn't even show up. My mom said she didn't want to take time off work for something so small. I pretended it didn't hurt. But I saw the way Emily looked down at her bouquet, how she blinked back tears when we walked out of the courthouse. She deserved better. Despite everything, I kept visiting my parents. I still called every week, still offered to help around their house, still acted like their rejection didn't matter. Then last month, Emily got sick. It started with fainting spells, then dizziness, and finally a night where she collapsed completely. I rushed her to the hospital, terrified. The doctors said she needed emergency surgery to fix an internal bleeding issue. The cost, $22,000. We didn't have that. Our insurance would only cover part of it, and I'd already burned through most of our savings after we'd both been laid off earlier in the year. I felt desperate, humiliated even, but I did what any husband would do. I went to my parents. They were sitting in their spotless living room when I told them. I could barely get the words out. My dad stayed silent the entire time, like he always did, and my mom just stared at me, tapping her nails on the armrest. When I finished explaining, she sighed and said, "Christian, you have to understand, we've done a lot for you already." I blinked at her. Like what? Well, she said, crossing her arms. We helped you buy your first car. That was 15 years ago, I said quietly. She gave a small shrug. Still, it counts. We can't just keep giving and giving. Mom, this is an emergency, I said. She could die without the surgery. I'm not asking for a handout. I'll pay you back every cent. She gave me that cold, polite smile she always used when she thought she was being reasonable. Christian, she's not blood. She's married in. I can't justify taking out money for someone who isn't family. I don't even remember how long I stood there staring at her, but something in me broke in that moment. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly. The kind of breaking you feel deep inside your chest, when you realize someone you love will never see you as equal. My dad looked uncomfortable, but he didn't say a word. He never did. I left without another word, drove home, and somehow scraped together enough through a combination of credit cards and a small loan. Emily got her surgery. She survived, but I didn't feel the same afterward. Something in me had shifted. When she came home from the hospital, she tried to convince me to let it go. They're your parents, she said softly. Don't let their choices ruin you. But how do you just let go of something like that? How do you forgive people who decided your wife's life wasn't worth saving because she didn't share their DNA? A few weeks later, my parents invited us to dinner. My mom said she wanted to smooth things over. I didn't want to go, but Emily, ever the peacemaker, said we should. So we did. Last night, we sat at the same table where I'd eaten every Sunday dinner of my childhood. My mom served roast beef and wine, smiling as if nothing had happened. Nathan and his wife, Allison, were there too, showing off pictures from their trip to Santorini, funded by my parents, of course. My mom kept gushing about how perfect the honeymoon was, how beautiful the ceremony had been. I just kept nodding, trying to keep my composure. Then, somewhere between dessert and coffee, Nathan made a joke about how marrying right pays off. My mom laughed, loudly, and said, well, not everyone has the same luck. Some of us marry into families that bring us up. Others marry people we have to bring up ourselves. Her eyes flicked toward me and Emily. The table went silent. Emily's fork froze midair. I could feel her hand trembling next to mine. My mom smiled like she'd just said something witty. Nathan tried to smother a laugh. That was the moment something in me snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. I looked around that table, at the people who had made me feel small my entire life, and I realized I didn't owe them another ounce of silence. I set down my glass and looked straight at my mother. You know what's funny? I said quietly, my voice calm but shaking. You always said family takes care of each other. But when it mattered most, you chose not to. Her smile faltered, just slightly. I leaned back in my chair, feeling every ounce of control I'd held for years finally slipping away. You said Emily wasn't family because she's not blood. But last night, my mother's smile froze in place, the kind that looked painted on but couldn't hide the flicker of unease behind her eyes. Nathan's fork clinked against his plate, and even my father looked up from his food for once, his brows drawing together in quiet confusion. I hadn't planned to speak that night, not really. My intention had been to endure the dinner, keep my head down, and leave early. But something about the way they looked at Emily, like she was an outsider sitting at their precious table, flipped a switch in me that I didn't even know existed. You said Emily wasn't family because she's not blood. I repeated, slower this time, my voice steady but low. But last night, when she woke up from surgery, the surgery you refused to help pay for, she thanked me for being her family. Not because we're related, but because I stayed when it mattered. The air in the room shifted. I saw my mother's fingers tighten around her wine glass. She tried to laugh it off, that condescending little laugh she used when she thought I was being dramatic. Oh, Christian, she said, waving a hand. You're still upset about that? We told you, it wasn't about the money. It's about principles. We can't just hand over thousands every time you get yourself in trouble. Trouble? I asked, stunned. You call your daughter-in-law's emergency surgery trouble? Nathan smirked. Come on, man. You can't expect mom and dad to cover every little crisis you have. You're 32. Be responsible. I stared at him, disbelief twisting in my chest. He was sitting there in a designer suit, one my parents had paid for. His watch alone probably cost more than Emily's surgery. Responsible? I said slowly. You mean like when Mom and Dad bailed you out of credit card debt last year? Or when they paid for your entire wedding? Or your honeymoon? Or the down payment on your house? Nathan's smirk disappeared. That's different, he muttered. Right, I said. Because you're blood. My mom sighed, putting her napkin down like she was tired of the conversation already. Christian, don't make this into a competition. You've always had a tendency to feel victimized whenever Nathan gets something nice. We did what we could for both of you. Really? I said. Because the only thing you've ever done for me was remind me that I'm second best. The silence stretched. Emily reached for my hand under the table, her grip light, a quiet reminder to stay calm. I looked at her, and that was what grounded me, seeing her face pale but proud, her eyes tired but clear. I could have stopped there. I could have let it go, taken the moral high ground. But then my mom spoke again, softly this time. Well, she said, tilting her head, it's not our fault you married beneath your means. Emily inhaled sharply. My dad's fork froze halfway to his mouth. Excuse me, I said, though I wasn't even sure if I meant it as a question or a warning. Mom didn't flinch. Emily's sweet, but she's not exactly, she gestured vaguely, ambitious. She doesn't have a career. She doesn't bring much to the table. You could have done better for yourself. We always imagined you'd end up with someone more stable. I felt the heat rise in my face. I could hear my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. Stable? She works 2 part-time jobs while studying for her degree. She's more stable than Nathan's ever been. Nathan leaned back, snorting. Don't drag me into this. You're already in it, I said. You always have been. Emily's hand tightened around mine again. Christian, she whispered, shaking her head gently, her eyes pleading with me not to sink to their level. But it was too late for restraint. Something inside me had been building for years, and now it was tearing through the dam I tried to patch with patience and politeness. I spent my entire life trying to make you proud, I said, turning to my mother. Do you know how many times I've come here hoping, just hoping, you'd look at me the way you look at him? But no matter what I did, graduating early, landing a job, buying our first home, it was never enough. You never once said you were proud of me. You just found new ways to remind me how I didn't measure up. Mom's expression hardened. You're being ridiculous. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Am I? Then tell me why, when Nathan totaled his car, you wrote him a check the next day, but when Emily almost died, you said, she's not blood. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Because family comes first, she said. The words hit me harder than I expected. I'd heard her say them 100 times growing up, usually when defending Nathan's mistakes or dismissing my feelings. But hearing them now, after everything, it finally sank in how hollow they really were. Family, I repeated. You keep saying that word like it means something. Christian, enough, my father finally said, his voice stern for once. You're ruining dinner. I turned toward him slowly. Dinner was already ruined the moment you all decided my wife's life wasn't worth saving. He looked away. He didn't deny it. Nathan muttered something under his breath, something like, overreacting. And that was when Emily stood up. Excuse me, she said quietly, her voice shaking but controlled. I need some air. She walked toward the patio, and I followed her instinctively. My mother's voice trailed behind me, calling my name, but I ignored it. Outside, the air was cool, the kind that smells faintly of rain even when the sky's still clear. Emily leaned against the railing, her back to me, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. I'm sorry, I said softly. She shook her head. Don't apologize. I knew tonight would be bad, but not like this. Her voice cracked slightly at the end, and it broke me. I should have protected you from them. She turned around and managed a small smile. You did, by standing up for us. We stood there for a while, just listening to the quiet hum of crickets, the muffled laughter still coming from inside. I thought maybe that was the end of it, that we'd leave, go home, and finally cut them out for good. But then I heard my mother's voice through the open window. She just wants his money. I told you, Nathan, girls like her know how to play the long game. My stomach turned to ice. Emily froze. Nathan's laugh followed. Yeah, I bet she's waiting for her payout when he finally cracks. Always knew she had that look. I don't remember walking back into the house. One second I was outside. The next I was standing in the doorway, and the room went dead silent when they saw my face. "What did you just say?" I asked. My mother blinked. "Christian, you weren't supposed to. What did you just say about my wife?" Nathan raised his hands in mock defense. "Relax, man. We're just talking. No need to get all worked up." I took a step forward. "You called her a gold digger. Both of you. After she nearly died. Watch your tone," my father said sharply, standing up now. "This is our house. And you think that gives you the right to humiliate her?" I shot back. Nathan scoffed. "Oh, please. If she's so sensitive, maybe she shouldn't be eavesdropping." Emily had come back inside by then, her eyes wide, but I could tell she was trying not to cry. My mom saw that and smirked. "Well, if she's going to marry into a family, she should expect some tough love. We just want what's best for you, Christian." I laughed again, but it came out hollow. "No, you want what's best for you. And that's Nathan staying on his pedestal and me staying in my place." My mother's face twisted into something cold. "If you don't like how we do things, maybe you shouldn't come around anymore." I stared at her, the words hanging heavy in the air. "Maybe I won't." For the first time all night, she looked unsure. My father frowned, probably realizing I meant it. Nathan looked amused, like he didn't believe I had the guts to actually walk away. And maybe that's what made my next words come out the way they did, quiet but firm, final in a way I hadn't felt before. "I've spent my whole life trying to earn a place at this table," I said. "But you know what? I don't want it anymore." I reached for Emily's hand and turned to leave, but before I did, my mother spoke again. One last blow she couldn't resist throwing. "You'll regret this," she said, her tone sharp. "We've always been the ones holding you up." I stopped in the doorway, my pulse thudding in my ears. "That's where you're wrong," I said softly. "You've only ever held me back." And as I led Emily out of that house, I had no idea that what happened next, the fallout from that dinner, would change everything forever. Because my family wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. After that night, I didn't answer my parents' calls. I didn't reply to Nathan's texts or their constant social media pings. For the first time in my life, I let them disappear from my day-to-day. It wasn't easy. For 32 years, I'd built my life around their approval, even if it was never really there. I felt unmoored, like a part of me that had been tethered to them was suddenly cut loose. But there was also a strange relief. A quiet space where I could think without them measuring me, without Nathan's smugness grating at the edges of my patience. Emily stayed by my side through it all. She didn't try to convince me to forgive them, and she didn't sugarcoat things. She simply helped me focus on the life we could build, away from their judgment. We started small, late-night walks, dinners at our apartment, little traditions just for us. And slowly, I began to feel the grip of my parents' favoritism loosen, though it left scars that weren't so easy to erase. The first few weeks were rough. I found myself replaying the dinner over and over in my mind, wondering if I'd been too harsh, if I'd handled it wrong. But then I remembered their words, the casual dismissal of Emily's life, the way they celebrated Nathan's every accomplishment while treating me like a shadow. The resentment I'd carried all those years crystallized into clarity. I didn't know them anything. I'd been living under their rules for decades, and now it was time to write my own. I threw myself into work. Emily and I had been saving for a small home when everything with my parents exploded, but I realized that my career had more potential than I'd given it credit for. I asked for more responsibility at the firm, volunteered for high-profile projects, and stayed late into the evenings, learning everything I could about management and client relations. I started to see the power in quiet competence, the kind that doesn't beg for recognition but earns respect by results alone. Meanwhile, Emily started her degree in nursing. Watching her struggle, study, and slowly thrive after her surgery was inspiring. She had this quiet determination, a drive to prove that she wasn't just married in, but a partner, equal in every sense. There were days she'd come home exhausted, falling into the couch with her textbooks sprawled across the floor, and I'd feel this immense pride in her. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a team behind me, not just someone standing beside me, but someone moving forward with me. Of course, the separation from my parents didn't come without pain. Christmas rolled around, and Nathan posted pictures of his family at a lavish party I wasn't invited to. Invitations to birthdays, anniversaries, even my father's retirement party arrived in my inbox, always addressed formally, as if I were a distant cousin instead of a son. Every email stung. Every post on social media felt like a deliberate reminder that I had been written out. But the more they tried to remind me of my place, the more I realized that my life was still mine to shape. I stopped trying to compete with Nathan, stopped trying to justify my existence in their eyes. Instead, I focused on building a home, a career, and a family with Emily. It was slow work, paying off credit card debt, fixing up our apartment, saving for a down payment. But each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been denied for years. One night, a few months after the dinner incident, Emily and I were sitting on our small balcony, overlooking the city lights. She had just finished a long shift, her uniform rumpled, hair tied back, and she looked at me with that same fierce determination that had gotten her through her surgery. "Do you remember the night your parents humiliated us?" she asked. I nodded. How could I forget? She smiled faintly. "I think that was the best thing that ever happened to us." I blinked at her. "What? Are you serious?" "Yes," she said. "Because after that, you stopped letting them control you. You started building a life that's ours, not theirs. You finally realized your worth." I leaned back in my chair, letting the cool night air wash over me. She was right. I had spent years bending, stretching, and compromising for people who didn't see me. But now, I was standing on a foundation that I had built myself. I was earning respect, not from them, but from myself, from Emily, from my coworkers, and from friends who had always believed in me. It wasn't long after that I started noticing changes at work. A major client had been difficult, threatening to pull their account due to miscommunications and poor service from previous staff. I volunteered to take over, dedicating nights and weekends to understanding every detail of their business. When I finally presented a proposal that exceeded their expectations, the praise didn't come from my parents. It came from colleagues, from my manager, from the clients themselves. That sense of validation was different, real. I realized I didn't need my parents' approval to feel accomplished. The small victories piled up. We bought a modest house, the kind with a tiny backyard and enough room for a dog, a place we could truly call ours. Emily excelled in her classes, eventually landing a job at a reputable hospital. I received a promotion, one I had quietly worked toward without their interference, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving forward on my own terms. Yet, even as life improved, the old resentment lingered, especially when I saw Nathan on social media. He posted constantly, vacation photos, new cars, dinner parties, achievements that my parents applauded publicly while ignoring anything I accomplished. The contrast was infuriating. I tried to ignore it, but sometimes the anger bubbled up, not toward Nathan, but toward the system my parents had built, a world where one child was always cherished and the other was an afterthought. And then came the betrayal I hadn't seen coming, the moment that would make everything personal and irreversible. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished a meeting that went exceptionally well, and I was looking forward to going home to Emily. My phone buzzed with a message from Nathan. At first, I ignored it, but then curiosity got the better of me. The message read, "Hey, saw your little post about your promotion. Congrats, I guess. Mom's throwing a dinner Friday. Would be nice if you came. She wants to see the two of you. Don't make a scene." I froze. The wording, casual, patronizing, commanding, set off every alarm bell in my head. I hadn't spoken to my parents since the dinner months ago. I had no intention of showing up. But curiosity and something deeper, anger, perhaps, pushed me to read on. Then came the part that made my stomach drop. A screenshot of a conversation between Nathan and my mother. They were laughing about me behind my back, plotting some kind of lesson to remind me of my place. It was cruel, calculating, and entirely intentional. They weren't just ignoring me, they were mocking me. Emily saw my face go pale and asked what was wrong. I handed her the phone, and she read the messages with a grim expression. "They're not done," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "They're planning something." I clenched my jaw. Every ounce of patience I had cultivated in the last few months evaporated. This wasn't just favoritism or dismissive behavior anymore. This was active malice. A game to remind me that no matter what I did, I would never outrun their control. That night, I sat on the balcony again, staring out at the city lights, trying to plan my next move. For the first time, I felt something shift, not just the slow climb back to respectability and self-worth, but a new fire. A need for not just distance from them, but accountability. They had crossed a line I couldn't ignore. I realized then that rebuilding my life wasn't enough. I had to take control of the story entirely. If they wanted to play games, I was going to learn the rules and beat them at their own game. Slowly, quietly, methodically. Over the next weeks, I began gathering information, financial details, old conversations, subtle reminders of their hypocrisy. Every email, every social media post, every boast about Nathan became a piece of a puzzle I was determined to complete. I wasn't acting rashly. I was calculating, biding my time. The fire inside me had transformed from anger into strategy. And as I sat there with Emily, I finally allowed myself to smile. Not because I was happy, but because for the first time, I felt truly free. Free from their judgment, free from their favoritism, and free to build a life on my own terms. I didn't know exactly when it would happen, or how, but I knew one thing. When I made my move, it wouldn't just be about proving them wrong. It would be about reclaiming every ounce of dignity and respect they had ever denied me. And I knew it would be spectacular. After weeks of simmering, Emily and I started putting together a plan. Not one of those impulsive, "I'll show them" ideas that dissolve after an hour of anger, but a slow, deliberate strategy. I had spent most of my life following their rules, letting them dictate my worth. Now, I was going to play by my rules, quietly, smartly, and with precision. It wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. It was about holding them accountable for every slight, every humiliation, every time they dismissed me in favor of Nathan. The first step was gathering information. Over the years, I had always been the quiet observer, the one who noticed the details that no one else did. While my parents were busy showing off Nathan's latest purchases, weddings, or vacations, I paid attention to the patterns. The way my mom managed the family finances, the way she loved to brag to her friends about her perfect children, the way Nathan depended on them for everything without ever contributing. I had access to old family documents, public records, and even a few contacts who had worked with them over the years. Every little piece mattered. Emily proved invaluable in this phase. She had an uncanny ability to remember names, dates, and details, and she kept me grounded when my thoughts threatened to spiral into something reckless. Late one evening, as we sat in the living room surrounded by spreadsheets and notes, she looked at me and said, "Christian, this isn't just about them getting what they deserve. It's about protecting us. If they're plotting behind our backs, we need to be ready." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. She was right. The small betrayal I'd uncovered in Nathan's texts wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a pattern, and I wasn't about to let it continue. Step 2 involved allies. Not the kind you brag about or announce to the world, but quiet, reliable people who could provide leverage if needed. I reached out to a former coworker who had done some freelance accounting for my parents' businesses. He remembered the tiny discrepancies, the inflated invoices, and the questionable charitable donations my parents loved to flaunt. He agreed to help, discreetly, no questions asked. Next, I reached out to my brother's former business associates. Nathan had started a couple of small ventures over the years, mostly funded by my parents, and while none of them were wildly successful, the people he'd dealt with had stories. Stories about his laziness, his entitlement, his inability to handle responsibility. Everyone I spoke to was shocked when I presented myself as Christian rather than Nathan. That alone gave me leverage. Nathan's reputation was inflated in my parents' minds, and it was time they were reminded of the truth. Meanwhile, Emily and I worked on our own assets. I refinanced a few properties I had quietly acquired over the years, investments my parents had laughed at when I mentioned them. They had scoffed, saying, You'll never make anything of that small business of yours. When in reality, I'd been quietly growing it, reinvesting profits, and waiting for the right time. Emily suggested a few strategic moves to maximize our position, legal, financial, and public perception all considered. And then, there was the social angle. I realized that my parents loved appearances more than anything. They curated this image of perfection, the golden son, the picture-perfect family, the flawless household. It was a mask, but one they defended fiercely. If I could expose cracks in that image, not through petty gossip, but through undeniable facts, I could hit where it would hurt most, their pride. I began tracking their social posts, their public boasting about Nathan, the lavish trips, the charity galas where they made a show of generosity. Every post, every photo, every brag was a breadcrumb. I started drafting ways to subtly juxtapose their public persona with reality, without revealing myself too soon. The goal was not to attack them recklessly. The goal was to create situations where their arrogance and hypocrisy would be exposed naturally, convincingly, in ways that left no room for deniability. All the while, I maintained the illusion of normalcy. My parents still tried to rope me into family events, unaware that I knew about their plotting. I played the part of the disengaged son, the one they could try to manipulate with guilt. I never revealed my knowledge of Nathan's texts or their plans. Every invitation I received, every passive-aggressive message, was carefully cataloged. Every slight, every microaggression became a piece of evidence. There was one evening, in particular, that crystallized the plan. Nathan had invited us to a brunch under the pretense of catching up, his words dripping with that smug tone he always reserved for me. Emily and I arrived, keeping our composure, nodding politely while he regaled us with stories about his hard work and the lavish wedding they had thrown themselves. At one point, he even leaned over and whispered, "I bet Mom's excited to see you squirm tonight." I smiled casually. "We'll see." He didn't know it, but I already had my next move mapped out. Every comment, every story he told, every subtle boast was being recorded mentally, filed away for the right moment. Emily caught my eye across the table and gave me a slight nod. She understood. This wasn't just dinner. This was reconnaissance. As the weeks passed, our confidence grew. I had quietly reached out to a few key people. A legal advisor who had handled a minor case involving my parents' charity work, an old family friend who had insight into their finances, and a few mutual acquaintances who owed Nathan favors. Each person was willing to provide subtle support, not out of malice, but simply because the truth had a way of catching up with people eventually. Then came the perfect opportunity, though I didn't realize it at the time. My parents had planned a second wedding anniversary party for Nathan and Allison, a slightly more extravagant affair than usual. Invitations had gone out, the guest list included business contacts and family friends, and everything was being treated like a showcase. This was the opening I had been waiting for. They were about to display their wealth, their perfection, and their control in one concentrated event. I didn't rush in blindly. I studied the guest list, noting those who held sway in social circles, those who had influence in professional and financial networks. I started sending private, innocuous messages, reconnecting with a few people Nathan and my parents considered allies. Each message was casual, friendly, almost invisible, but carefully placed. By the time the party rolled around, I had subtle but powerful allies in attendance. People who could quietly confirm facts, lend credibility to my claims, or simply witness the hypocrisy that I planned to expose. Emily and I also refined our approach. We didn't want this to feel like a confrontation. It had to be controlled, precise, and undeniable. I spent hours rehearsing conversations in my mind, scenarios where my parents' arrogance would reveal itself naturally. Emily helped me anticipate reactions, plan exits, and ensure that we weren't leaving any loose ends. Every detail mattered. The timing of our arrival, the placement of our seating, even the clothes we wore, everything was calculated to maximize impact without tipping them off. In the days leading up to the party, I noticed my parents becoming more insistent. "We hope Christian and Emily will be there," my mother texted repeatedly. "It's important for the family to celebrate together." I smiled privately each time. knowing they had no idea that our attendance wasn't about joining their celebration. It was about seizing the moment they were handing me on a silver platter. I also kept tabs on Nathan. He was more oblivious than usual, flaunting his success, bragging to anyone who would listen, sending Emily snide comments disguised as jokes. Every boast was ammunition, every slip of arrogance a brick in the foundation of what I was about to construct. By the night of the party, everything was in place. Our allies were positioned, our evidence secured, our timing perfected. I walked into that hall not as the quiet, overlooked son, but as someone who had spent months quietly building power and strategy. Emily by my side, I felt an unfamiliar sense of control, a sense of inevitability. As we approached the main table, Nathan noticed us first. His smirk faltered slightly when he saw me, though he tried to recover quickly. My mother beamed, oblivious to the storm that was about to unfold. I leaned down slightly to Emily and whispered, "This is it. Everything we've built, everything we've prepared, it's all about to intersect." She nodded, her hand slipping into mine, firm and steady. I could feel the same anticipation in her grip that I felt coursing through me. At that moment, as the room buzzed with laughter, music, and clinking glasses, I realized just how much power comes from patience, from careful planning, from understanding your enemies better than they understand themselves. The entire stage was set, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just ready to confront my family. I was ready to rewrite the story entirely. But I wasn't rushing it yet. The timing had to be perfect. The fallout had to be undeniable. And when it came, it would change everything forever. The night of Nathan and Allison's second wedding anniversary party arrived, and the room was a picture-perfect display of everything my parents loved to flaunt. Crystal chandeliers, gold-rimmed glassware, a 5-tiered cake that looked like it belonged in a magazine, and every table crowded with family friends, business associates, and socialites. My parents were glowing, the kind of proud they always reserved for Nathan, while he and Allison posed for pictures like the perfect couple in a curated Instagram feed. Everyone else, the guests, the servers, the musicians, seemed caught up in the spectacle, oblivious to the undercurrents bubbling beneath the surface. Emily and I arrived precisely when we planned. Not early enough to be noticed, but not late enough to miss the speeches and toasts. We dressed modestly but elegantly, the kind of understated sophistication that doesn't scream wealth but commands attention. I could feel the calculated looks of my parents scanning the room as we walked in, expecting them to see two polite guests. They had no idea that the quiet, overlooked son they dismissed for 32 years was about to orchestrate their undoing in front of everyone. As soon as we entered, I spotted a few key allies I had subtly positioned. My father's old business consultant, who had quietly collected evidence of financial mismanagement over the years, was seated at a table near the head of the room. Across the room, a few of Nathan's former associates mingled with other guests, their expressions carefully neutral but alert, knowing they were witnesses. These people weren't overtly involved, but if anything went wrong, they could confirm everything with credibility. The evening began predictably. My mother went on and on about Nathan's success and the couple's perfect life. Nathan boasted about a new investment he had made with my parents' money, completely ignoring the fact that it had nearly collapsed because of his negligence. The guests clapped, laughed politely, and nodded as my parents' egos swelled. I let it play out, letting them feel untouchable, letting the spectacle reinforce their belief that they were in control. I waited for the right moment, the apex of their arrogance. It came during the toast. Nathan's friend, a local entrepreneur, got up to speak. He started praising Nathan's work ethic and implied that his parents' support had been crucial. Everyone applauded, including my parents, beaming with pride. I stood, slowly, and raised my glass. Silence fell. "I'd like to add a few words," I said, my voice calm but carrying across the room. My parents' smiles faltered slightly, unsure what I intended. Nathan's face went pale, though he tried to mask it with a nervous chuckle. "I've been quiet for 32 years, I continued, watching this family reward one child while dismissing the other. I've been polite, helpful, and accommodating. I've smiled while seeing my brother's every mistake covered, while my achievements were ignored, and while my wife, someone I love more than anything, was treated like an outsider. But tonight, I think it's important for everyone here to understand exactly what this family values. I paused, letting my words sink in. I saw a few heads turn, curiosity mixed with unease. Emily's hand squeezed mine under the table. I could see the slight glances from our allies, each one ready to back me up if needed. You see, my parents have always claimed that family comes first. That's their mantra. But when Emily, my wife, needed emergency surgery, when her life was on the line, they said she wasn't family because she isn't blood. Meanwhile, my brother, who has made a career out of relying on others, has been celebrated, rewarded, and bailed out time and again. And everyone in this room, knowingly or unknowingly, has been part of perpetuating this illusion. Murmurs started to ripple through the guests. My mother's face went from pride to shock. Nathan opened his mouth, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Let me continue," I said, my voice steady, controlled. "I've worked quietly, rebuilt my life, and ensured that I no longer need the approval of people who would see me diminished simply because I am not the chosen child. I am not here to cause a scene. I am here to expose a simple truth. Appearances can be deceiving. Wealth, social standing, and charm do not equate to virtue or integrity. And tonight, the truth will speak for itself." I clicked a button on my phone, and the projector we had subtly set up earlier flickered on. A slideshow began, showing screenshots, bank records, and carefully documented instances of favoritism, financial mismanagement, and hypocrisy. Photos of Nathan's misadventures, texts between my parents mocking me and Emily, even evidence of inflated expenses for his lavish weddings, all laid bare for the guests. The room went silent. My mother's lips pressed together so tightly I thought they might crack. Nathan's confident facade crumbled. He looked around at the room as if expecting someone to intervene on his behalf. No one did. Our allies had ensured that this presentation was undeniable. Everything was factual, everything verifiable, everything impossible to deny. I turned to my parents. "You built an empire of appearances, where one child is celebrated and the other dismissed. Tonight, everyone here can see it for what it truly is." My father opened his mouth to speak, but the consultant I had positioned stood up and confirmed every detail, his voice calm and authoritative. "These documents are accurate," he said. "The discrepancies in accounts, the unequal treatment, the financial favoritism, everything here is verifiable. Christian has presented this with evidence, and it all checks out." The room was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, suffocating. My mother's face went pale, her carefully maintained poise crumbling under the weight of exposure. Nathan looked around desperately, realizing that the pedestal he had been perched on for decades had been quietly dismantled. Guests whispered among themselves, some in shock, some in disbelief. The carefully curated illusion of perfection my parents had maintained for 30-plus years was gone in a single, calculated reveal. I took a deep breath, letting the gravity of the moment settle. "I'm not here to humiliate anyone," I said, turning to the guests. "I'm here to illustrate a simple fact. True family is measured not by blood or appearances, but by actions, by loyalty, by integrity. And if you can't demonstrate those values, it doesn't matter how expensive your parties are, how lavish your trips, or how perfect your Instagram feed looks. You will be exposed eventually, and it will not be pretty." Emily stood beside me, her hand firmly on my shoulder. The pride in her eyes was almost overwhelming. I realized then that this was more than just revenge. This was reclaiming our lives, asserting our worth, and refusing to be silenced or diminished any longer. By the end of the evening, the fallout was undeniable. My parents barely spoke, their pride shattered in front of their social circle. Nathan slunk away, humiliated, his arrogance completely stripped away. Friends and business contacts looked at them differently, some politely excusing themselves, others openly questioning the narrative my parents had built. It was more than I had imagined. It was perfect, but calm, measured, undeniable. Emily and I left the party together, quietly, without fanfare. Outside, the cool night air felt like a cleansing wave. We didn't celebrate with champagne or cheers. We simply held each other, knowing we had done what was necessary, done what we had always known needed to be done. As we walked toward our car, I glanced back at the house, the scene of so much manipulation, favoritism, and cruelty. And for the first time, I felt something I had never felt in my entire life. Complete and unshakable freedom. No more favoritism. No more manipulation. No more standing in the shadow of someone else's life. The past could no longer touch us, because we had reclaimed it, quietly, calmly, and completely. I turned to Emily, a small smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "We did it," I said. She squeezed my hand. "We did." And for the first time in decades, I walked away from my family not broken, not small, not overlooked, but victorious. Because some things are worth more than blood, and some victories are sweeter when the world sees the truth in full. That night, I didn't just take back my dignity. I rewrote the rules of my life, and no one could ever take that away. I'm Sam, 32, and if you told me 5 years ago that my own family would try to drag me into court after I saved them from financial ruin, I'd have laughed in your face. Back then, I still believed that family loyalty meant something, that when you helped the people you loved, they'd remember it. I know now how naive that was. The first crack in that belief started the day I walked into my brother's failing business and realized how deep the mess was. My older brother, Michael, had always been the golden one in our family, the charismatic one, the one who could talk his way out of anything. My parents adored him. I was the responsible one, the one who quietly handled things in the background, never making a fuss. So when Michael's logistics company started falling apart due to a few bad investments, as he put it, everyone looked at me to fix it. He came to my office one evening, looking worn out but somehow still confident, like he knew I wouldn't say no. "Sam," he started, rubbing his temples, "I just need a small bridge loan. A few months. You know how these things go. Clients delay payments, and suddenly you're cash-strapped." A small bridge loan turned out to be a gaping hole of debt, some of which was tied to shady deals with my cousin Andrew. I didn't know that part yet. All I saw was my brother, desperate and scared, and my parents calling me afterward, their voices trembling, not with worry for him, but with expectation. "You're the only one who can help him," my mother said. "You've always been so good with money." And like an idiot, I agreed. I liquidated a portion of my investment portfolio and covered nearly $200,000 of his business debt, thinking it would be temporary, that he'd pay me back. He never did. Michael shut down his company a month later, vanishing for a reset trip to another country. I was left with angry creditors calling me, demanding payment on loans I didn't even know existed. When I finally pieced everything together, I found out Andrew, my cousin on my mother's side, had been using Michael's company as a funnel for his own side deals. He was supposed to have contributed capital, but instead, he'd been taking money out. That's when I learned that family loyalty in our clan was a one-way street. After that disaster, I distanced myself from most of them. I poured my focus into my own business, a small but rapidly growing logistics firm that I'd built from the ground up. Within 2 years, I was thriving, running operations across 3 cities. I didn't owe anyone anything. I stopped attending family gatherings, ignored the snide comments about how cold I'd become, and for the first time in my life, I felt in control. I should have known peace never lasts long when greed runs in the family. It started subtly, a message from Andrew after nearly 2 years of silence. "Heard you're doing well. Congrats, cousin. We should talk soon. Might be some opportunities for collaboration." I ignored it. Then came another one. "Mike's been in touch. He mentioned some of the business overlaps between your companies. Maybe we can make something work." That message made my stomach twist. My brother hadn't contacted me in almost a year. The idea that he and Andrew were talking again didn't sit right. I didn't reply. I figured they'd lose interest if I didn't engage. A few weeks later, I got a call from my dad. He sounded uneasy, his usual calm tone replaced with something brittle. "Sam," he said, "you should know Andrew's been asking around about your company. Something about a partnership agreement." I told him to drop it, but you know how he is. I did know. Andrew had this smug, entitled confidence, The kind of guy who thought everyone should be grateful to have him around. In our family, he was treated like the strategic thinker, though I'd never seen him actually work a day in his life. A week after that, he showed up at my office. No appointment, no call. Just waltzed in wearing a navy suit that screamed, "I want to be taken seriously." He wasn't alone. Behind him stood a man in a gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. Andrew smiled like we were old friends catching up. "Sam, long time no see," he said, extending his hand. I didn't take it. I could feel my employees watching from the front desk, uneasy. "What do you want, Andrew?" I asked. He sighed, pretending to be patient. "It's not about what I want, cousin. It's about fairness." He opened his folder, pulling out a thick stack of papers. "See, Michael and I had a verbal understanding. You covered the debt, sure, but that money went toward assets that should have been divided. So technically, a portion of what you have now might belong to us." I laughed, actually laughed. "You're joking." His lawyer cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, my client has documentation suggesting." "There's no documentation," I interrupted, "because there was no agreement. My brother's debts were personal, not shared assets. You can take that nonsense out of my office." Andrew's tone shifted. The fake friendliness vanished. "Sam," he said slowly, "you don't want to make this ugly. It's just a signature. You give us our fair share, and we'll stay out of your hair." I stood up, feeling my pulse pound in my ears. "Get out." He smirked, tapping the folder against my desk. "Sign, or else." That was the first time I felt genuine rage. Not just anger, but something heavier. I motioned to security. "Escort them out." They left, but not before Andrew leaned close enough to whisper, "You'll regret this." Later that evening, as I was packing up to leave, my phone rang. It was my uncle, Andrew's father. I hadn't spoken to him in years. His voice was low, strained. "Sam," he said sharply, "this stops now. I just found out what Andrew's doing. They're coming to your house tonight to beg you to sign something. Do not open the door." My blood ran cold. "Beg me?" I asked. "Yes," he said firmly. "Do not engage. They've gone too far." I froze, staring at the front door like I could somehow unsee what was happening. My mind raced. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. The 3 knocks were deliberate, slow, Andrew's signature style of intimidation. My heart hammered, a mix of fury and fear bubbling up. I didn't want to see him, didn't want to engage, but the thought of him barging into my life and trying to take what I'd built without consequence lit a fire in me. I grabbed my phone and called the local police non-emergency line, just to have a record, and told them someone was threatening to enter my home under false pretenses. They said someone would come by to check, but until then, I was on my own. I decided not to answer the door. Not immediately. I moved to the window and peered through the blinds. There they were. Andrew, his smug grin plastered across his face. Michael lurking behind him, looking uncomfortable but entirely too relaxed for my liking, and some other cousin I barely knew, standing stiffly like a hired actor. My stomach twisted. I wanted to yell, to slam the door, but I kept myself still. This wasn't a confrontation I could rush. This was the culmination of years of manipulation, entitlement, and favoritism. I thought back to my parents, who had always excused Michael's mistakes, praised his charm, and overlooked his failures. I remembered the countless family gatherings where I'd quietly sit through conversations dripping with praise for my brother's ambition, while any of my own achievements were shrugged off or dismissed as luck. It stung every time, and yet I tolerated it. I had to. I wanted to be the good son, the responsible cousin, the one who kept the family afloat. But looking at Andrew and Michael now, standing on my doorstep with that smug, entitled confidence, I realized I hadn't just tolerated it. I had been enabling it. I stepped back from the window, breathing hard. Something inside me snapped. Enough was enough. I couldn't be the victim anymore. I couldn't let them walk into my house, uninvited, thinking they had any claim over what I'd worked so hard to build. I locked the door, bolted it, and moved the heavy dining chair I kept against it. Then I called my attorney, someone I'd spoken to years ago about potential family disputes, just in case. "Sam," he said, a little surprised to hear from me at night. "What's going on?" I explained everything, leaving nothing out, the debts, The threats, the appearance at my office, the looming visit. He didn't say much, just asked me to stay put and not engage with anyone who might escalate things. Minutes passed, and the knocking resumed. More insistent this time. Andrew's voice carried over the porch, shouting, "Sam, open up. We're family. Don't make this worse than it has to be." Michael stood beside him, nodding like he was some kind of harmless accomplice, though his eyes flicked to the windows as if calculating the best way to convince me to relent. The audacity made my blood boil. They had no right. None. Yet here they were, expecting me to drop everything, welcome them in, and surrender. Then something unexpected happened. My mom's voice came through the phone. She had called, probably tipped off by one of the cousins. "Sam, please," she pleaded. "You have to let them in. They're your family. Don't make them feel unwelcome." My grip on the phone tightened until it almost cracked. "Mom, I'm not giving them anything. They don't deserve it. They've never deserved it," I said, my voice shaking, though I tried to make it sound firm. There was a pause on the line. I could hear her breathing. Then she whispered, almost conspiratorially, "They're scared, Sam. They just don't know what they're doing. You have to trust me on this." Trust her? After everything? After Michael skipped out on the debts I'd covered, after Andrew tried to strong-arm me in my office, after years of favoritism and being overlooked? My heart ached in a way I didn't expect. The betrayal wasn't just coming from my cousins. It was from the people who were supposed to have my back, my parents. My dad had always said that family comes first, yet the only time I'd seen them come first was when it suited Michael or Andrew. Now, at a critical moment, they were trying to guilt me into submission. I hung up, furious but resolute. I wasn't giving in. Not now. Not ever. I went into my home office, grabbed my laptop, and started drafting a detailed log of every financial transaction, every moment of manipulation, every interaction with Andrew and Michael. I wanted everything documented, every phone call, every email, every meeting where they tried to undermine me. My hands shook as I typed, but I knew I couldn't let anger cloud my actions. This wasn't about a fight anymore. This was about protection, about justice, about finally proving that I wasn't the weak, overlooked cousin anymore. Hours passed. The knocking never fully stopped, though it had slowed. I could hear Michael's voice occasionally, trying to reason, trying to charm. "Sam, we're just trying to make things right," he called at one point. I stared at the door, imagining all the years he'd spent taking advantage of me, manipulating our family, pretending to be the golden boy. I remembered the time he convinced our parents to give him the car I had been saving for, telling them I didn't need it as much as he did. I remembered the countless parties where my accomplishments were ignored while his mediocrity was celebrated. My hands gripped the edge of my desk until my knuckles turned white. And then, the betrayal that changed everything happened. My cousin Andrew, seeing that I wasn't opening the door, took a step forward and pulled out his phone, recording a video on the porch. I didn't notice at first. He was pretending to film Michael, but his gaze flicked to my window, capturing me as I worked frantically at my desk, documenting everything. I realized too late. He intended to twist this, make it look like I was paranoid, aggressive, even dangerous. He was already building a narrative that I'd be unable to defend against, using social proof to paint me as the villain. My stomach dropped. They were trying to weaponize my own vigilance against me. I considered going out there, confronting him, but something in me, the part that had survived years of manipulation, held back. I couldn't let them bait me. I sat there, heart pounding, staring at the door as the porch light flickered over their faces. Andrew's smirk was infuriating, his confidence infuriating, the sense of entitlement infuriating. And then Michael spoke, his voice softer, almost persuasive. "Sam, come on. We're family. You don't have to do this. We just want to talk." But I knew better. There was no talking, no reasoning. Family loyalty had long been a one-way street. Their actions, their sense of entitlement, their constant manipulation, it all culminated here, and I realized I wasn't just fighting for my assets or my business anymore. I was fighting for my dignity, my sanity, the principle that just because they called me family didn't mean they could trample over me. Then came the knock, louder, more urgent this time. I glanced at the window, and saw Andrew gesturing wildly to someone behind him. My heart skipped. Who else was here? My dad? Another cousin? They were escalating, testing my limits, and I could feel the tension coiling in my chest like a spring ready to snap. I reached for my phone to call my attorney again, but the battery flashed red. The reality hit me. I was on my own for now. And then, the final straw, the moment that pushed me past any hesitation or doubt. A voice, familiar and chilling, cut through the night air, my mother's. Sam, she shouted from the porch, her tone shaking with an odd mix of fear and insistence. Please, just open the door. You don't understand. It's urgent. I froze, torn between disbelief and rage. My mother? She was standing there with them? After everything? After years of watching me struggle while she coddled Michael and ignored my efforts, she had come to pressure me into submission? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Even my closest allies, my own parents, were capable of betrayal when it suited them. I backed away from the window, breathing heavily, my mind racing. My parents had just crossed a line that I couldn't ignore. Everything I had built, every sacrifice, every careful decision, every moment I'd endured their favoritism, had led to this. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was shaken, betrayed on every front, and fully aware that nothing about this situation would be simple or safe. After that night, I couldn't sleep. The image of my mother standing there on the porch, urging me to open the door alongside Andrew and Michael, kept replaying in my mind. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was grief, the kind that comes when you realize the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are capable of manipulation and betrayal. I stayed in my office until the early hours, reviewing every contract, every transaction, every interaction I'd had with my family over the past decade. I needed clarity. I needed a plan. I needed to understand how I had let this get so far. The next morning, my phone was flooded with messages from my parents. My mom's texts were pleading, alternating between guilt trips and rationalizations. Sam, you don't understand. We're only trying to help. They're your family. You can't turn your back on them. You've always been stubborn. Don't let this go too far. I ignored every single one. If anything, their messages made me angrier and more resolute. I realized that my family didn't just take for granted my generosity. They actively relied on it, manipulated it, and now they were punishing me for finally setting boundaries. I decided to shut down communication completely. I changed my phone number, blocked every family member from my social media accounts, and made sure my home had a new security system with cameras and motion sensors. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of safety in my own home. But safety didn't erase the emotional damage. I felt hollow, defeated, and utterly alone. The sense of betrayal was heavy. It weighed on me like a physical presence. I couldn't even look at my office without remembering Andrew's smug grin and Michael's calculated charm. The first few weeks were brutal. Work that normally brought me joy, planning logistics, negotiating contracts, expanding my business, felt meaningless. Every time I saw a courier truck, every time I answered an email, I was reminded of the chaos my family had tried to bring into my life. I considered selling the company, walking away, just to escape the stress. But then a thought struck me. They hadn't broken me yet. Not really. And they never would, if I refused to let them. That realization was small, but it was the first step toward rebuilding. I started slowly, focusing on the business with renewed intensity. I worked late into the night, not just managing logistics, but reimagining the entire structure. I hired a few trusted colleagues, people I had known and respected for years, and together we started innovating. We expanded routes, optimized operations, and developed a client base that made my company resilient in a way Michael's business had never been. For the first time, I was working for myself, and only myself. The satisfaction of building something untouchable, something they couldn't manipulate or coerce, was addictive. At the same time, I worked on myself. I realized that the years of favoritism and neglect had shaped me in ways I hadn't fully acknowledged. Therapy became my sanctuary. Talking through the trauma of my family's entitlement, the constant comparisons, the manipulation, helped me understand the deep-rooted anger I had been carrying. I learned to value my accomplishments without seeking validation from the people who had spent their lives dismissing them. I learned that my worth wasn't tied to family approval. That, in fact, my family's opinion was often a reflection of their own inadequacies. Months passed, and the change in me became noticeable. I was calmer, more strategic, and fiercely protective of my boundaries. My company thrived, attracting high-profile clients and partnerships that I had only dreamed of before. The sense of independence was intoxicating, and with it came a quiet satisfaction. I no longer needed approval from the people who had undermined me. Their absence, once a source of pain, became a relief. I was free to focus on growth, on building something lasting and meaningful. But of course, peace rarely lasts in a story like mine. One afternoon, while reviewing quarterly reports, I received an unexpected email, an invitation to a business networking event in the city. The sender was vague, but the language hinted at opportunities too good to pass up. I hesitated. My instincts screamed caution, but part of me craved engagement, craved the feeling of being part of a world beyond the shadow of my family's chaos. I decided to attend, but I went with a plan. I wouldn't reveal my full identity, wouldn't let anyone connect me to my family, and I would observe. The event was massive, a hotel ballroom filled with entrepreneurs, investors, and executives. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, listening, learning, and quietly making connections. My confidence grew as I realized that my accomplishments spoke for themselves. People weren't impressed by my family name. They were impressed by my strategy, my results, and my poise. For the first time, I felt validation that didn't come with strings attached. I felt alive, capable, and powerful. It was there, in that crowded ballroom, that I encountered a familiar face, someone I had hoped never to see again, Andrew. He was chatting with a group of investors, laughing, gesturing like he belonged. But this time, I saw cracks in his facade. His posture wasn't as confident as it had been on my porch. His eyes flicked toward the other attendees constantly, seeking approval, reassurance, validation. Unlike me, he hadn't built anything real. He was riding on borrowed charm and the reputation of my family. My heart surged with a mix of vindication and quiet satisfaction. I didn't confront him then. I didn't need to. I realized that my rise was already happening quietly, invisibly, while they were still trapped in the same patterns of entitlement and dependence. I could feel it, the scales tipping. I spent the rest of the evening networking, securing partnerships, and laying the groundwork for expansion. By the time I left the event, my mind was buzzing with possibilities. I had rebuilt my confidence, my business, and my sense of self-worth. Still, the past wasn't gone. Andrew's attempt to manipulate me, Michael's passivity, and my parents' betrayal had left scars. I knew they wouldn't simply disappear. I could feel the tension, the anticipation that they might strike again. But now, I was no longer the same person who had caved to their pressure. I had emerged stronger, smarter, and fully aware of my value. The knowledge that I could withstand their schemes, that I could rebuild even after being pushed to the brink, was intoxicating. Weeks turned into months, and my life took on a rhythm of disciplined success. I expanded my company into new markets, hired talented staff who shared my vision, and finally started enjoying the sense of security I had longed for. I even invested in a small, quiet home away from the city chaos, a sanctuary where I could breathe without the fear of uninvited visitors. Yet every time I checked the security cameras, part of me expected to see a familiar shadow on the porch, Andrew or Michael, or even my mother, trying to breach my boundaries again. And then came the day that changed everything. A package arrived at my office, unmarked, no return address. Inside was a folder, thick, organized, and unmistakably formal. My heart sank as I realized what it was before even opening it. Legal documents, probably another attempt by Andrew to stake a claim, to drag me into family disputes I had spent months trying to escape. But there was something different this time. The folder didn't just contain papers. It contained photographs, detailed financial statements, and what looked like evidence of Andrew's own mismanagement, his schemes, and the ways he had relied on my money and influence to cover failures of his own. For the first time, I realized that the power had shifted. I was no longer vulnerable. I had the upper hand. The knowledge of his deceit, combined with the resilience I had built over the past months, meant that I could finally plan a response that wasn't reactive. It would be deliberate, calculated, and undeniable. I felt a strange thrill, a mix of dread and anticipation, knowing that I could expose him, protect myself, and finally hold him accountable. I spent the evening going over the folder, mapping out every angle, every piece of leverage I had. The weight of my past frustrations and betrayals now fueled a clarity I had never experienced before. I realized that this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about principle, about finally asserting that no one, not Andrew, not Michael, not even my parents, could dictate my life or undermine my accomplishments. By the time I set the folder down, I had a plan forming in my mind. A quiet, patient strategy that would allow me to rebuild my life fully, secure my company, and finally confront those who had wronged me on my terms. I felt ready, not just to face my family, but to turn the tables completely. The past months of isolation, reflection, and rebuilding had forged a version of me that was stronger, sharper, and more determined than ever. And yet, even as I felt this surge of empowerment, I knew one thing. The next confrontation would be more than just a showdown. It would be a reckoning, a test of everything I had rebuilt, and I was ready to meet it head-on. I just had to be patient, calculated, and unyielding. After I went through the folder Andrew had sent, I realized something critical. The upper hand wasn't just mine anymore. It was undeniable, concrete, and lethal if used correctly. For years, I'd been reactive, letting my family's whims and manipulations dictate my emotions and actions. Not anymore. This time, I could dictate the narrative. And I knew exactly how to do it, quietly, methodically, and without giving them a single clue. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about yelling or confrontation. It was about precision. The first step was gathering intelligence. I spent days digging through public records, corporate filings, and social media activity linked to Andrew, Michael, and even my parents' investments. I discovered a web of dependency and mismanagement that they had carefully hidden from most of the family. A network of shady loans, overvalued properties, and shell companies Andrew had used to siphon money from ventures that were supposedly joint family enterprises. Michael, predictably, had no real operational knowledge, only charm and the ability to convince people he was essential. And my parents? They had consistently shielded Michael and Andrew from accountability, often signing off on financial decisions they didn't understand themselves. What I realized was frightening. If I exposed any of this, it wouldn't just be Andrew who took a hit. The fallout could cascade through the family entirely, and I wasn't afraid to let it. I spent hours cataloging every piece of evidence, making notes, cross-referencing financial statements, and identifying the moments where they had overstepped boundaries. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, about proving that entitlement and manipulation had consequences. But planning wasn't enough. I needed allies, people outside the family who could help me execute a strategy that wouldn't backfire. I contacted a few trusted colleagues in finance and legal operations, people who had always respected my integrity and knew my work ethic. I briefed them carefully, leaving nothing vague, emphasizing the need for discretion. The first meeting was intense. I laid out every piece of evidence, every financial irregularity, and every instance of manipulation. This isn't about hatred, I said. This is about accountability. If we do this right, it will be clean, indisputable, and devastatingly effective. They listened, nodded, asked questions, and offered insights I hadn't considered. One pointed out that Andrew's public-facing ventures were fragile. A single misstep could erode investor confidence. Another suggested using social media and press releases strategically, creating pressure without ever making me appear aggressive or reactive. For the first time in months, I felt not just confident, but unstoppable. This was no longer a reaction. It was a plan, and it was carefully engineered. While I built my team, I also began fortifying my personal life. Security cameras were upgraded, locks reinforced, and a monitoring system installed for real-time alerts. I even hired a private investigator to track Andrew's movements discreetly. The goal wasn't intimidation, it was preparation. I needed to know exactly where they were, who they were meeting, and how they were attempting to manipulate any part of my world. One afternoon, I received a tip from my investigator. Andrew had been quietly trying to engage with one of my old clients, a significant account, under the guise of a collaboration. He was trying to convince them that I was unreliable, that Michael had superior knowledge, and that the debts I had covered were somehow evidence of instability. My blood boiled, not just because of the audacity, but because this was exactly what I had anticipated. And yet, instead of rushing to confront him, I paused, letting the information sink in. Knowing where he was and what he was doing meant I could control the timing, the exposure, and the impact. Meanwhile, I began an internal project, a full financial audit of my own company, highlighting transparency, reliability, and growth potential. I wanted to make sure that when the moment came, I could demonstrate irrefutable success. Andrew had relied on my generosity and perceived weakness. I needed to prove that I had not only survived but thrived despite their interference. Every detail mattered: profits, client satisfaction, expansion metrics, employee loyalty. I compiled it into a comprehensive report that could serve as both a shield and a weapon if needed. Then came the psychological component. I had to anticipate their reactions. I thought about Andrew's arrogance, Michael's dependence on charm, and my parents' tendency to interfere emotionally rather than logically. I predicted exactly how each would respond if confronted with evidence of their mismanagement and entitlement. Andrew would likely try to gaslight me, Michael would attempt flattery, and my parents would attempt guilt. By anticipating their behavior, I could design the exposure so that it wouldn't just be about finances. It would undermine their perceived authority, credibility, and influence within the family and beyond. Over the next few weeks, I orchestrated what I called the silent stage. I kept communication minimal, only responding when necessary, and I subtly tested the waters by observing how Andrew tried to navigate around me. I didn't engage with him directly. Instead, I allowed third parties to relay information. It was fascinating to watch. He grew increasingly restless, attempting small manipulations that would have worked in the past, trying to insert himself into partnerships, using mutual acquaintances to sway opinion. Each attempt was carefully noted, each interaction cataloged. Every misstep he made built the foundation for the eventual exposure. One evening, as I reviewed the latest intelligence reports, I realized something else. Michael, who had always been the golden child, had quietly started emulating Andrew's tactics, calling old contacts, trying to charm investors, even subtly undermining my staff. He had learned from Andrew, and the combination of both of them made it imperative that I act with precision. I could no longer rely on simple patience. The opportunity had to be seized at the perfect moment, with no room for error. By the end of that month, I had everything aligned, evidence cataloged, allies briefed, a full strategy in place, and the perfect timing identified. It was all about leverage, using their own entitlement and arrogance against them, ensuring that any attempt to interfere would result in their downfall rather than mine. I wasn't seeking destruction for the sake of anger. I was seeking balance, accountability, and the final affirmation that I had survived and thrived despite them. And then the call came. Not from my family, not from Andrew, not from Michael, but from an unexpected source, one of my former clients who had been quietly observing the drama from a distance. "Sam," they said, almost breathless, "you need to know that Andrew's missteps are creating serious vulnerabilities. Investors are asking questions, and it's only a matter of time before someone notices. If you play this right, you can finally reclaim what's yours, and then some." Their words cemented what I already knew. The pieces were in place. The timing was perfect. All that remained was execution. I spent the next few days rehearsing the plan in my mind, envisioning every scenario, every possible reaction, and every method to ensure the outcome would be undeniable. I had patience now, something I had lacked for so long, and I intended to use it ruthlessly. As I looked at my reflection late one night, Preparing to finalize the last pieces of my strategy, I realized how far I had come. From being a naive, responsible cousin who had been manipulated and taken advantage of, I had transformed into a calculated, strategic force. I understood their psychology, their weaknesses, and their predictable patterns. I had rebuilt my company, my confidence, and my life. And most importantly, I had regained control. By the time I moved to execute the plan, I felt not vindictive so much as inevitable, like a weather front finally reaching a place it had been circling for months. I had stopped being the cousin who always gave the benefit of the doubt. I had become someone who could read people so well their next move looked like an instruction manual. The folder Andrews sent me, the photos, the invoices, the shell company registrations, they were the skeleton key. My team and I had spent weeks corroborating everything, lining up witnesses, securing time-stamped records, and drafting a clean narrative that would be impossible to spin away with charm or tears. I wasn't going to humiliate them for sport. I wanted justice, neat, public, and irreversible. Step 1 was quiet and bureaucratic. I filed a complaint with the proper regulatory agencies detailing the loan funnels and fraudulent transfers Andrew had orchestrated. I attached the mountain of evidence I'd compiled: bank statements, emails, contractual drafts in Andrew's handwriting, and evidence of misappropriated funds diverted into companies he controlled. Because I'd been meticulous, because I'd anticipated every possible counterargument, the complaint was airtight. Within days, the agency opened an inquiry. That seemed small until I realized how fast inquiry turned into audit and audit into subpoenas. The ice was cracking. At the same time, I disengaged my personal narrative from the legal route and let the market do the rest. I quietly briefed a small group of trusted journalists and industry analysts with anonymized excerpts of the dossier. The facts without the melodrama, enough to make anyone with a stake in Andrew's ventures look twice. The goal wasn't to create a scandal for clicks. It was to create an environment where investors would start asking questions on their own. When the board of one of Andrew's small, investor-backed ventures saw the first auditor's notice and the industry press picking up on irregularities, their reaction was immediate and severe. Funding lines froze. Board members started demanding emergency meetings. Investors who had once fawned over Andrew's vision suddenly wanted documentation, oversight, and accountability. That's when the cascade began. Andrew, who had always relied on momentum rather than substance, found the momentum evaporating. Partners who had been willing to overlook red flags suddenly wanted proof. Vendors who'd extended credit began calling in invoices. One by one, companies that had been propped up on borrowed charm and family guarantees started to show their true colors. I watched from the sidelines as people who'd once treated me like the dependable cash-out began calling their own lawyers, asking for meetings, and, in a few cases, quietly severing ties. The humiliation of those who had built their lives on other people's generosity is not a pretty thing to watch, but it's a necessary one when the alternative is letting manipulation go on unchecked. While the external pressure grew, I moved on the personal front with the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed every scene. I sent certified letters to family members detailing the transactions and requesting formal reconciliations. I did this not to bait them into an argument, but to force a record, a paper trail that would exist independent of their narratives. Michael tried the old playbook: charm, apologies, obfuscation. He sent me messages about family unity and misunderstandings, and even attempted to slip me into a private meeting where he promised to make things right. I let him talk while I recorded the conversation. After giving notice that it was being recorded, I played by the rules. His promises were empty, as I'd known they would be. His language contained the same evasions and vague commitments that had gotten him into trouble in the first place. The recording was another clean, incontrovertible piece of the story. My parents were the hardest to expose because the relationship with them carried more complication than a ledger could ever show. They believed they had protected their children. They believed their choices were acts of love. If love becomes a pattern of ignoring consequences, it ceases to be a kindness. That's what I had learned in therapy and what I intended to show them with facts rather than accusations. I sent them a letter summarizing everything, asking them to recuse themselves from any family financial decisions and offering them one private meeting with my attorney to discuss a resolution. I wanted transparency, not punishment. It's dangerous to conflate punitive action with healing, and I didn't want this to be about vengeance against my parents. I wanted it to be about stopping the cycle. They didn't respond with the grace I hoped for. My father wrote a terse letter accusing me of betrayal. My mother called my office in tears, saying she only ever wanted what was best for the family. But the tide had already turned. The auditors had asked for documentation from companies my parents were associated with, and lawyers were suddenly interested in signatures they had made years ago. The very protections my parents had thought immune, the verbal assurances, the casual signatures on family paperwork, were suddenly scrutinized. They had helped create a system where accountability was optional. I had made it non-optional. The legal proceedings were methodical and surprisingly clinical. No dramatic courtroom speeches, no soap opera reveals on television, just subpoenas, depositions, and the kind of slow, patient dismantling that makes the foundation of a house look fragile. Andrew's ventures were dissolved one by one. Creditors attached assets. A few investors sued for restitution. Regulators penalized a handful of companies for lack of disclosure. Michael's role, always hyped as essential, emerged as that of a figurehead, a symptomatic personality who took credit without responsibility. He faced penalties for signing corporate documents without oversight. Andrew, however, took the hardest fall. The evidence showed a consistent pattern of diverting funds, creating shell entities, and misleading investors. He was barred from serving as an officer or director in several corporations and faced civil judgments that cost him everything he had been counting on. Public reputation matters more than most people realize. Andrew's carefully cultivated image, the smooth-talking relative who showed up in nice suits and confident smiles, crumbled under the weight of plain documents and depositions. Friends stopped answering his calls. Two of his closest partners cut ties and publicly distanced themselves. The daily calculations he once used, charm versus consequence, no longer worked. He would call me once, twice, 3 times, pleading for leniency. I forwarded the calls to my attorney. It wasn't cruelty. It was a boundary. There were practical wins as well. Some of the funds misdirected into Andrew's shell companies were traced and recovered through restitution settlements. They were small victories in a long battle, but they had symbolic weight. They reversed, in a measurable way, the theft by which he had profited. I set up a framework to reclaim any family assets that had been improperly transferred, working with the agencies and legal teams to ensure due process. When restitution checks started arriving, a part of me wanted to throw them away in a fiery display of catharsis. Instead, I used the recovered funds to establish a small trust for the employees who had lost their jobs when Andrew's schemes collapsed. They weren't part of the family saga. They were collateral damage. Making them whole felt, in a way, like reversing the moral ledger. The fallout inside the family was messy in ways paperwork can't wipe clean. Family reunions, the few that remained, were awkward, strained, and occasionally hostile. Some relatives blamed me for airing dirty laundry, as if truth-telling were a crime. Others quietly thanked me, confessing in private that they had seen the inconsistencies for years but felt powerless to do anything. The most painful part was not the legal victory, but the slow recognition that the family as I had known it no longer existed. The roles had changed. The dynamic that had centered entitlement and silence had been broken, and with that break came grief. Michael disappeared for a while. I don't know where he went exactly. His messages stopped coming. Andrew, who once strutted into rooms like a man who owned the air, was a cautionary example of what happens when charisma outruns substance. My parents oscillated between regret and defensiveness. We had one meeting with a mediator to discuss boundaries and a family financial charter, essentially a document that would prevent future unilateral decisions disguised as family help. They agreed to it begrudgingly. That agreement, signed and witnessed, felt like a small victory, a promise on paper that words had failed to secure for decades. There were personal consequences for me too. Revenge, even when measured and deliberate, leaves marks. I had to mourn the idea of a family that could have been different. I had to accept that protecting myself had cost relationships I might have once cherished. The nights after the settlements were quieter than I expected. The adrenaline that had propelled me through meticulous planning finally ebbed, leaving me with a stillness that could be uncomfortable and honest. I allowed myself to feel the emptiness and the relief, the two sensations occupying the same room. But I also noticed something else, a resilience that wasn't about being unbothered but about being wholer. I had rebuilt my business, yes, but more importantly, I'd rebuilt my sense of self. I no longer sought validation from the people who had gaslighted me into believing I was secondary. I had a company that respected its employees, clients who appreciated transparency, and a circle of friends and colleagues who had shown up without an agenda. I started mentoring young entrepreneurs, sharing with them not just logistics tactics, but lessons about boundaries, ethics, and the quiet power of accountability. It felt generative rather than destructive, a channel for the energy I had used to dismantle entitlement. The last formal act in the entire saga was anticlimactic in some ways, but profoundly satisfying in others. At a routine shareholders meeting for one of Andrew's remaining ventures, I submitted a written statement summarizing the timeline of mismanagement, attaching key documents, and asking for a vote to dissolve the remaining shell entities and appoint a receiver for asset disposition. The board, many of whose members had quietly been pushed to act by the audit's pressure, agreed unanimously. No dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just the steady efficiency of governance doing what governance is supposed to do when given facts and authority to act. After the legal dust settled and the restitution checks were sent, I did something simple and symbolic. I bought the small rental property my cousin had once joked about stealing, the very property that had been shuffled through shell companies, and turned it into a community workshop where unemployed logistics workers could retrain, reskill, and find placement. It was an act that felt like putting a stake in the ground. The thing they had used to leverage power would now be a place that created stability for others. I don't tell people that part to sound magnanimous. I tell it because it mattered to me that whatever I did in response had a constructive endpoint. Months turned into a year. The headlines had faded, as headlines do. Andrew's name was a case study in boardrooms now. How not to run a company, and how to let charm outrun competence. Michael remained a cautionary footnote. My parents and I had a few cautious conversations. We never returned to the comfortable intimacy of the past, but we found a brittle civility. It wasn't perfect, and I carried the ache of what had been lost, but I also carried the quiet satisfaction of having drawn a line. The final moment, the kind movies compress into a single shot, happened on a gray Tuesday morning. I was at my desk, reviewing a logistics proposal, when my assistant popped her head in and smiled. We just received a thank you from the community workshop. A former driver got a job through the placement program. I felt that warmth you get when you've done something right simply because it needed doing. I walked out to the small courtyard behind the office, sat on the bench I'd installed there, and breathed the kind of steady breath that comes after danger and work. If someone asked me now whether I regretted the path I'd taken, the investigations, the exposure, the family ruptures, I'd answer honestly. I regret the pain it caused because pain to anyone you've loved matters. I don't regret ending the cycle of entitlement because unchecked entitlement destroys more quietly and cumulatively than most people realize. I learned that boundaries are not the opposite of love. They are its backbone. Standing up for myself didn't make me a monster. It made me someone who refused to let others treat generosity as an open tap. When everything was said and done, the last conversation I had with Andrew was short and clinical. He left a voicemail the week the final restitution was issued. I listened once, then saved it to the folder with all the other artifacts. His voice was quieter than I remembered, stripped of the bravado that had once felt like armor. He asked for forgiveness and for one last chance to make amends. I considered answering, and for a second I thought of all the things I might say. Then I deleted the voicemail. Revenge, I learned, is less about retribution and more about restoring a balance that lets you sleep at night. The end wasn't a gloating victory. It was a return to the ordinary world with a clearer map. I had reclaimed what was mine, protected what mattered, and in the process built something that couldn't be taken away by charisma or family myth. I walked away from the rubble with scars and with lessons, with losses and with repairs made real. I closed the file on the case, not with a triumphal slam, but with a steady, quiet click, the sound of a drawer closing on a chapter that had been necessary, terrible, and finally, just. The last line of the drawer's label read, "Accountability, family." I taped it shut, walked outside, and opened the door to the workshop to greet the morning.